The singing in church was something that grabbed me from a very, very young age. It was, and it is, and it always will be powerful in my eyes. And there's just something about Gaelic psalm singing that moves me. Doesn't matter where I am. If I hear it, it just brings me back to my youth growing up in Staffin. It brings me back to happy events such as both my sisters getting married, and it also brings me back to very, very sad events.
How do you introduce the Psalms, or the Gaelic Psalms? Well, I'll tell you the way that I was introduced to them and the way they were introduced. It started off in family worship. That's where it all started. Family worship when I was young happened morning and evening in pretty much every house in our village. I lived over in Callanish, Briaslit on the west side. In my youth, all families, whether they were Christians or not, they held family worship. In villages on this island here, you could actually walk through the village and hear the singing happening at different houses all the way along the road. And some families were known to be great singers.
My own experience of psalm singing is, as a child, all the services were in Gaelic, and all the services included Gaelic psalm singing. When there was a bereavement, when there was a wake, the service was in the homes, as opposed to nowadays it's all in the churches. So they would have wakes in the houses, and you were in the house and you heard the psalms, but also as children we would be out on the hill sitting listening to the psalm singing as which was part of the wake. So I think from a very early age I started to appreciate the sound of psalm singing in the land and the environment.
They used to have hymns that corresponded to the various parts of the Mass. So they'd have a hymn for the Confiteor, a hymn for the offering of the bread and wine, a hymn for the consecration of the bread and wine, a hymn at communion, and a hymn perhaps for the dismissal. And this was where Father Allen's work comes in, because he produced poetry which was then of course set to music. Very short verses, sometimes just 4 lines, which were actually very catechetical. The purpose of the singing was not simply to praise God, but to get the people to understand what was happening at the Mass. So Father Allen produced that, and he also produced other hymns, especially around about Christmas time. Father Allen was a pioneer there when it came to Gaelic hymnody.
Father Neil McKellick, who was in St. Peter's in Dalyborough, he asked me to come up and speak to him about the possibility of introducing some new hymns in Gaelic. Father Neil said, I would like to get you to meet Donald John MacDonald, the bard, because I think you two could work well together to create some new hymns. So a few days later, that was the first time I met Donald John. And I was going back to Glasgow just a few days later, and the next day, really, what did I get through the post? But the first of the hymns from Donald John. He'd done it more or less overnight and sent it on to me. And it was the Law of Chríosta. That was the very first one.
In the Gaelic Presbyterian tradition, the hymn singing, it's more like spiritual songs than hymns. People associate hymns with worship in churches. You know, they sing psalms or they sing hymns. but the Gaelic hymns aren't, the composers of the Gaelic hymns, I don't think they composed them to be sung as worship songs in churches. At least that's my take on most of them. Most of them were born out of experience that the author might have, a spiritual experience, and they would compose a song, a spiritual song around that experience, which would resonate in the hearts, and minds of others. Katrina Campbell, she composed a lot of spiritual songs which would never ever be used in worship in church, but which would be sung in companies, in gatherings. I always thought that the spiritual songs had a spiritual dimension to them, and it's certainly through, I'm taking Katrina Campbell as an example because when you read her poetry and sing her songs, they resonate with you. It's not just a language thing. There's a great spiritual input into it.
O hiken basons chanakashin, Sentider narach kuprachati, Bevavinuashin fayene vuachil, Enyaunet vuachvarahul. Well, that's a few of his verses, you see.
But
it was a good hymn. He could sing it himself too.
He was converted.
A very rough.
He knows what he got, that he saw that
Yes.
Jesus given to his life.